Audiobook Always Visible, Another Prayer for the Dying Horror Genre, by Vitaly Ivolginsky. Based on the motion picture Omen IV, The Awakening. 9th chapter. A man looked at him from the mirror, whose resemblance could be described as an adult, who, surprisingly, was at the development level of a 12-year-old boy. Joe gave this epithet to himself for the simple reason that the clothes that he could find in the closet were small in size, and on his dystrophic, but still mature body, such a wardrobe looked extremely stupid. But feeling that his dog was waiting for the treasured piece of meat, he cast aside the feeling of awkwardness that had begun to overcome him and, slightly tucking his black and white hair protruding from under his cap, went to the butcher's shop. By the time Mr. Thurlow finally got there, the hour hand on his wristwatch already showed 6:25. The young guy who was trading was already preparing to close, but Joe, who arrived in time, still managed to contact him. "Give me all sorts of scraps, no matter what," such was his request, which the seller complied with, noting among other things that the tripe that his last buyer took had already managed to spoil a little. But Joe didn't care one bit about this, because even back when he lived with his mother, he learned that the dog that guards the house, not the one that runs within its walls, to maintain her energy, she must eat a large amount of raw meat, and it does not matter whether it is fresh or slightly rotten. Never in their entire lives did they feed first Buddy, the Thurlow's first dog, whom Joe first saw during his childhood, and then Buffalo with all sorts of dog food, for the mother believed what was written in some old book on dog breeding, given to her by one former military man, her acquaintance. Taking the bag of meat in his hands, Mr. Thurlow noted to himself with pleasure that for once he would please his faithful dog, who had been running around the territory entrusted to him for all these 6 days without the opportunity to eat anything. And wished good luck to the butcher, more precisely, his son, who sold in this shop. Joe headed back home with a smile on his lips. And imagine his surprise when, passing by his neighbor's house, he heard his name pronounced in a ringing voice that was already familiar to him. He froze rooted to the spot at some distance near the fence. From the outside he probably looked funny. An adult man, dressed in shorts and a t-shirt that was clearly too small for him, was holding a heavy bag of rotten meat scraps in both hands. In fact, it was quite obvious that such a spectacle would inevitably cause laughter from his little neighbor. And so it happened. Bursting with laughter, Delia sat on the fence, dangling her legs shod in black shoes. Joe didn't know what to do, so he stood there a little undecided and decided to go to his house, but as soon as he took a couple of steps towards his wicket, he immediately caught her question in the back. "Have you got a dog, a Jessie Joe?" Mr. Thurlow was a little surprised that the girl, who was essentially seeing him for only the second time in her life, immediately addressed him in such a familiar tone, but he didn't even show it, but stopped again and turned to her. "Don't run away from the child, after all," said. "Yes, we live here together. I'm at home and Buffalo is out." "He's protecting you, right?" "Certainly. I can't stand dogs that eat their owners but don't do any good." For some reason, Joe decided that there would be no shame in complaining to this girl a little. "My dad thinks so too," his interlocutor answered. "We never had animals at home, although I asked him." "Yes, it's sad." Mr. Thurlow thought that this was the end of their conversation, and, making a slight bow in her direction, walked up to the wicket. Delia looked after him for a while, and then suddenly jumped off the fence and managed to run up to Joe just then, when he was already preparing to close the wicket and feed his dog. "Will you show me your dog?" The girl said this and made a sad grimace. "She press on pity or how," thought Joe. "Wait, I'll feed him first," he began. Yes, I heard you promise him this," Delia interrupted him. "But please let me look at it." Mr. Thurlow thought for a few seconds. He felt that the little neighbor, who, due to her age, was simply bursting with the bursting desire to learn as much as possible about the world, will never leave his humble person behind, and, trying to drive the dog away from the wicket, Joe almost quickly threw out his answer to her. "If you ask your dad for permission and he doesn't mind, then I'm in." Without waiting for Delia's response, he slammed the gate and headed towards the bowl where he always put food for Buffalo. The latter was already so exhausted from hunger that he tried to jump on the owner and tear the bag right as he walked, but Joe, who tried to instill in the dumb dog the concept of discipline, angrily shouted at him to be patient. When he finally reached the bowl, Buffalo still managed to tear the bag open with his teeth. Tripe, some chunks, and also some meat juice began to fall out of it, emitting a rather disgusting aroma of rotten meat. Mr. Thurlow noted with displeasure that drops of juice fell on his bare legs and, immediately rushed to the bathroom. There, without wasting any time, he took off all his clothes and, contrary to his usual routine, decided not to fill the bath but to stand under the prickly jets of the shower. Thoroughly soaping your feet in order to completely get rid of the annoying smell, he noted to himself that, it turns out, he again made another promise, and it would be nice if this person had known him for a long time. Starting to wash his hair, Joe began to reason that making a promise to a neighbor who lives next to your house is not the same as doing the same to a person who lives God knows where. When he had already finished washing and began to dry himself, Mr. Thurlow no longer doubted the correctness of his just-made decision. Joe started looking for something to wear. His beautiful suit, which he had stained with flour, continued to lie on the floor next to the bathroom. In a hurry to the butcher, he completely forgot about it, and in the end he had only the option of putting on the clothes of an overgrown teenager again. It can't be helped, Joe said, and, putting cap on the go, no longer for the sake of hiding flour in the hair, but for health, went out into the yard. His faithful Buffalo was busy eating tripe. Joe couldn't resist the pleasure of watching his dog for a couple of minutes, listening as he let out a predatory purr as he paid tribute to his first meal in 6 days. "Yes, chum, forgive me for not feeding you for so long," Joe said, barely audible. Then he remembered Delia. I wonder if she really ran to ask permission from her gloomy father, or if she, seeing that her neighbor was busy, finally decided to leave him alone. Joe really wanted things to work out this way, but the sense of duty, which was caused by the promise given to her, forced him to go out the wicket. Covering it behind him, he looked around. The girl was nowhere to be found yet. Mr. Thurlow decided to wait a couple of minutes and, not knowing what to do with himself, began to look at the fruit tree that grew on his neighbor's property. It was an apricot that old Harris Sherwind planted many years ago in memory of his deceased grandfather. Now, in August, there was no longer a single fruit on the branches, but Joe still had fresh memories of when Harris, who had previously lived here, was distinguished by the breadth of his soul, collected the fruits falling from the tree and went to his close neighbors, treating them to fresh apricots. Oddly enough, but last July, it was by this month that the fruits were already ripening. Old Harris, apparently already preparing to move out of here, broke this tradition of his, and not one of the apricots that poured on the branches fell into the mouths of any of his neighbors, including Joe. Either he simply forgot about the tree, or, more likely, he collected those fruits and sold them on the market, uncharacteristic for him, but normal behavior for a person who lives in the suburbs on his own plot. The realization that the Yonce family moved in exactly the same month when all the apricots had long since disappeared caused Joe to have another fit of uncontrollable laughter. He, trying to restrain himself from laughing at the top of his lungs, bit the inside of his cheeks. The sudden pain caused a tear to come out of both his eyes, against his will. Mr. Thurlow was about to wipe them with the back of his hand, but before he had time to raise his hand, he caught movement from the side of the neighbor's gate in his peripheral vision. Forgetting about his face, Joe turned. His eyes did not deceive him. Delia was actually running towards him now, gesticulating animatedly. She stopped 5 steps from him and, not knowing where to put her hands, rested them on a fence post. "Jussie Joe, Dad allowed me to go into your yard." "For what?" All of a sudden, the energy typical of children her age made him wary, and Joe decided to play the fool. "Well, how can it be, Jussie Joe, you promised to show me your dog," again making a sad grimace, the girl answered with some anguish. "You know," Joe raised his top hand and began scratching the back of his head, "for some reason it seems to me that you, Am I lying?" "Oh, you're a cad," Delia suddenly exclaimed with sudden aggression. Wait, I just want to hear it from your dad in person," Joe realized what he had done and began to make excuses. Huh, are you afraid? You big crybaby. Declaring this decisively, Delia took a breath, tilted her head back slightly and, completely unexpectedly for Joe, spat right in his face. The latter stood stunned in place and looked after the girl, who was running towards her gate. Stepping over the threshold, she turned her head in his direction and sent him a smile filled with playful mischief. Mr. Thurlow stood there without moving. He heard from someone that if swallowed it, this automatically lowers status in the eyes of the offender, so he patiently waited until the neighbor disappeared behind the fence. Joe was overwhelmed by a whole ocean of feelings. He felt resentment, shame and fear at the same time. The first is from the fact that they spat on him, the second from the fact that with his words he clearly did something wrong, and the third from the understanding that an offended child could complain to his formidable dad. Slowly moving his feet, Mr. Thurlow walked into his house. Entering the bathroom, before putting his cheek under the running water, for some reason he took a piece of this saliva on the tip of his finger and brought it to his nose. These white bubbles gave off a faint aroma of mint candies. Apparently, Mr. Yonce has a liberal attitude towards spoiling his daughter with sweets, Joe thought while washing his face. Well, or a wayward girl, after what he had just experienced, he had no doubt about it, herself, when she wanted it, contrary to her parents, she found the desired forbidden fruit. Mr. Thurlow decided so, because Delia's father looked like a domineering man who clearly had his family under control, and it would obviously not be sweet, in every sense, for his daughter without any effort on her part. Wiping his wet face after the water, Joe remembered her cry, "You big crybaby." Were two tiny tears on his face really that obvious? Or was Delia angry that an adult man suddenly, for no reason at all, began to fawn over her and make excuses, like her young peers? A suspicion crept into his thoughts that among her classmates she clearly has the status of an out-and-out hooligan, who only acts like an obedient girl in front of her father. Unsure of this theory, Mr. Thurlow threw a towel on the washing machine next to the sink and trudged into the kitchen. He knew for sure that he didn't want to eat, firstly because he had a good lunch with a friend that afternoon, and secondly, this spit from Delia managed to completely discourage Joe's sense of appetite, which had gradually begun to increase in the evening. Therefore, having already automatically opened the refrigerator, he did not take anything from there. Fortunately, there was nothing to take anyway. There was nothing in the refrigerator except an empty glass jar of some kind of sauce. Slamming the door, Joe took off his t-shirt, wet with sweat, and, throwing it on the radiator, went into the office. There, his gaze immediately fell on a leather folder, which seemed about to burst from the papers that overflowed it. He opened it and pulled out sheets of paper on which, in his small handwriting, he had written information about Munich's book bestsellers. Mr. Thurlow's eyes ran down the list he had painstakingly compiled during those 5 days spent in his cramped hotel room. Yawning, he packed the sheets back. He absolutely did not want to continue this work, at least today. All Joe wanted at the moment was a good night's sleep. He didn't try to persuade himself. He went into the bedroom and, taking off his shorts, which were too small for him, fell flat on the pillows. He made himself comfortable and wrapped himself completely in the blanket. Multicolored lines hovered before his eyes, quickly intertwining with each other. Gradually he fell asleep. "Forgive me, Jordan Thurlow." For the first time during this time, the inspector interrupted the prisoner's story. "But for some reason I was amused by how your relationship with this person developed. First, in your words, you almost died under her gaze, and then unexpectedly you fought back. As they say, from love to hate." Joe, tired of talking, was breathing deeply and looking forward at the policeman. He, having taken on the role of listener, for obvious reasons, did not show a single sign of fatigue. On the contrary, he looked slyly at Mr. Thurlow, clearly interested in his story. Joe did not reproach the inspector for interrupting his story. "No, Mr. Inspector Galbraith, there was no affection that evening, and where would it come from?" he answered the last phrase of his interlocutor. "Then, standing on the outside of the Yonce's fence, I was scared. I felt like I had been shot with a bullet laced with poison. You're a joke though, Jordan. I have never heard such a definition of the arrows of the Cupid from anyone at all. The inspector, teasing his interlocutor, noticed that wrinkles appeared on the latter's face near the eyes. Might have thought that Joe was trying to fight off the onset of sadness. However, this only lasted a couple of moments. The prisoner suddenly smiled and answered. Who knows, Mr. Inspector, maybe it will be easier for strangers to notice such changes. Jordan sniffled and wanted to blow his nose into his sleeve, but Inspector Galbraith prevented his action by taking a clean handkerchief from the pocket of his gray jacket and handing it to his interlocutor. He thanked him, blew his nose noisily a couple of times and put the handkerchief on the table next to him. Yes, take it for yourself. What am I, greedy or something? The policeman said cordially. Mr. Thurlow thanked the inspector again and, putting the handkerchief in the pocket of his orange prison suit, continued his story from where he was interrupted a couple of minutes ago. Joe greeted the new day with a severe headache, having not yet really woken up from sleep. He, wincing from the spasms running through his brain, barely got out of bed and sat down on the blanket that had been crumpled during the night. Soon, when his eyes were finally able to focus, he was able to roughly understand the cause of this illness. Outside the window the rain was pouring down like buckets. Mr. Thurlow read somewhere that with the change of weather, certain magnetic storms pass over the territory, which in people with poor blood circulation cause pain in the brain, similar to what he is now experiencing. In any case, for Joe, who, in his own words, was a professional procrastinator, the headache was not any serious hindrance, because he had to turn on his brain very, very rarely. He even forgot how to solve arithmetic problems from the moment he finished his studies at high school. Even when he had to deal with paying for some services he needed, he used to honestly declare that he hardly knew how to count, and as a result, this could sometimes result in sellers cheating him, as he once had with the purchase of buffalo through Newell Saberlow. But Joe has long lost any pieces of pride that anyone who lives in society should have. Be that as it may, the headache, although it did not interfere with his business, was an obstacle to a happy pastime. It's not so easy to even just walk when there is a risk of falling somewhere with blackness in eyes. So Joe decided not to go anywhere today, but just sit quietly with some reading material in his hands. Rinsed lightly under running cold water, he wrapped himself in his battered green bathrobe and, looking in the mirror, thought that before he could take in the food of his mind, he also needed to provide food for his stomach. He didn't even need to open the refrigerator to remember that there wasn't a single crumb of food in his house. It's sad, he thought, he'll have to wait out this ill and then go to the store to buy something. Slightly shivering from the cold, Mr. Thurlow went into his office and began to look for some interesting book in his small library, which was located in a bookshelf that occupied the entire wall, all the inheritance that he received from his maternal grandmother, like this house itself. His eye caught the strange name that intrigued him, the Book of Light. The hands themselves grabbed this book in a hard blue cover. Plunging into a chair, Joe prepared to read this manuscript, which, for some reason, it seemed to him, could tell the reader about the lives of the servants of the Templar Order and their infamous curse. He himself could not explain why this name evoked such associations in him. Apparently his hunger for information about the novels of Walter Scott and similar authors he loved as a child affected him. Sitting by the window, he involuntarily plunged into memories of how this book got into his house. It was just recently, last month, when Mr. Thurlow, having finished his short workday, walked out of the door of his place of work and, taking a deep breath of the warm July air, leisurely walked along the wide sidewalk towards the boulevard, which he could see from his office window. He had not yet walked a few steps when he caught the eye of a man standing near the wall of a building decorated with decorative tiles. Joe was immediately struck by the fact that despite his good build and youthful appearance, the stranger's long hair was completely silver, as was the thick beard that covered his entire face. Mr. Thurlow walked past him, but the stranger suddenly moved away from the wall and followed him. "Take a book," the silver-haired man spoke inaudibly but loudly enough. Joe, without slowing down, looked back. The stranger, stretching his arm forward, somehow strangely minced his feet, almost dancing as he walked. His voice sounded too young for his aged face. Apparently he used some kind of hair bleaching product. But at the moment that was not the point at all. The crazy light that burned in the man's eyes testified to the extent to which he was out of his mind. "Take a book, take a book, take a book," raising his voice, he muttered, jumping with every step. "What's the matter?" Mr. Thurlow asked sternly, trying to break away from his pursuer. "Let you take a book." "I'm has good book," the wacky said, shaking his whole body. Joe quickened his pace a little, hoping that his shadower would leave him behind, but where there? This silver-haired man, dressed in denim overalls, has become even bolder, his movements became even more fussy, and the wacky began to mince his feet even more energetically, continuing to repeat the same word, which now sounded like takabuck. He pronounced it so incoherently. This was starting to get on Mr. Thurlow's nerves, but his upbringing didn't allow him to start running. Eventually the crazy man overtook him and stopped on the road, blocking his path. "What's the matter?" I said. Joe repeated his question even more sternly. "Take one, just one book," said the pursuer, mumbling lips. With these words, the wacky grabbed him by the sleeve and pulled him towards him. Mr. Thurlow silently shook off his hand and walked forward, but this only provoked the silver-haired man in denim overalls even more, who, without stopping for a second, began to pursue him again, coming in from one side, then from the other, like an annoying jackal. Joe was already starting to get angry, but the stranger, dancing around him, pressed harder and harder, as if trying at all costs to prevent him from passing. "Get lost," Joe replied through clenched teeth, looking with hatred at the insane smile on the face of his pursuer, covered with thick silver hair. "Take a book and I'll go away," the wacky was already screaming, continuing his attempt to grab his hand. Meanwhile, Mr. Thurlow had already approached the store, which at that time was crowded with quite a lot of people. The people gathered at the showcase looked in bewilderment at this strange dance of the silver-haired man in denim overalls, until some tall, thin man in a tracksuit decided to intervene. Grabbing the madman by the shoulder, he tried to pull him away from Joe, but he stubbornly resisted his strong hands. "I'm has good book and he have none. I beg him for take a book," the silver-haired man shouted loudly. "Chill out, gaffer," the sportsman tried to calm him down. "I follow him for half an hour already. Let him take a book." The wacky in denim overalls did not stop. The madman lied. He chased Mr. Thurlow for about 3 minutes, God willing, but for this he managed to bring his victim to such a state that if it had not been for the intervening athlete, the silver-haired man would probably have had a hard time. Joe walked through the crowd, but felt an object hit him in the back. Turning around, he saw the wacky remove his hand from the pocket of his denim overalls, while the athlete continued to tenaciously hold him by the shoulders. Mr. Thurlow looked down and saw an open book lying in the dust. It was not difficult to guess what the madman had thrown at his back. Bending down, Joe picked her up from the asphalt and, holding her under his arm, continued his way to the bus stop, while a policeman appeared at the store window and began to perform his duties, namely, to detain the silver-haired madman in denim overalls. Joe was distracted from his memories by a phone call. Fortunately, the telephone was right next to the chair. He didn't even have to get up to pick up the receiver, although the very fact that he was disturbed at a very inconvenient time for him made Joe mentally say goodbye to the prospects of overcoming his headache. Stretching his hand towards the telephone, Mr. Thurlow began to turn over in the back of his mind the people who might disturb him at such an early hour. He was sure that it could not be his boss, Ruth Vardiel, for all who were under his command were well aware of 2 facts from his life. First of all, Mr. Vardiel liked to lie in bed with his wife Camille until lunchtime, which is why he didn't show up at work until 22 in the afternoon, and secondly, he was not one of those who needlessly disturbed his employees during non-working hours. Besides him, Joe also immediately dismissed Japhet. After their get-together yesterday, his not very sociable friend hardly wanted to call the person with whom he spent almost the entire day. So who called him? Clutching the telephone receiver, Joe, still wincing from his headache, held it some distance from his eyes for a couple of seconds, as if trying to mentally transport through the speaker holes to the distance to the subscriber's device at the other end of the line, and, deciding that it was enough to hesitate, he brought it to his ear. "Mr. Thurlow, did I disturb you?" Joe heard a voice unfamiliar to him, clearly belonging to an adult woman. "Hello, with whom do I have the pleasure of speaking to?" he asked politely. Joe decided that since the person was unfamiliar, it was better to speak in much the same way as when working with clients. "I apologize that we were not able to meet with you yesterday, unlike my husband," the stranger answered as if apologizing. "I'm not sure what you mean, madam," Joe asked. Mr. Thurlow was already beginning to lose his temper a little, because he hated it when people, instead of immediately telling him what they needed, began to evade his questions. "Sorry, I forgot to name myself. I'm Yvette Yonce, your new neighbor." Joe was numb. The moments of yesterday's incident that occurred between him and the young representative of this family flashed feverishly through his head, like pictures in a kaleidoscope. Trying not to show fear, although he already felt how his unfounded ligaments were beginning to stiffen, he asked, "How can I be of service to the wife of the esteemed Mr. Yonce at such an early hour?" "Oh, there's no need to be so familiar with me, as in any way we don't live nearby." Mr. Thurlow heard his interlocutor burst into laughter. He almost physically felt as if a stone had been lifted from his heart, the tension preceding it was so strong. He laughed in response, although his laughter was not so much from joy as from nerves. When, as it seemed to him, 2 minutes had passed, the voice of his interlocutor reached his ears. "Could you do us a favor, Mr. Thurlow?" What, excuse me?" Joe, who had not expected such a development in the conversation, immediately suppressed his laughter. "I would never have asked you about this if my husband had not said okay, my joy, I agree at yesterday's family council," answered the woman. More riddles, thought Joe, how much beat around the bush. "And what is your request, Mrs. Yonce?" "Yvette, please call me Yvette," his interlocutor corrected him. "Why should that be?" didn't understand Joe. "You know," she began to explain. "First names are much more friendly, and since we are neighbor, then—" "Well," Mr. Thurlow interrupted her. "So what do you want, Mrs. Yvette?" Finally, he heard a sigh. Apparently, the woman on the other end of the line was tired of delaying this conversation. After being silent for a couple of seconds, she continued. "It's all because of Delia. Baby tried to persuade us to let her look at your dog, that we, knowing full well what everything could lead to if we refuse, not only allowed her to enter your yard, but also allowed her to visit your home." Mr. Thurlow felt the fear that he had managed to calm down begin to devour him from the inside again. He, rubbing his forehead with his left hand, on which drops of sweat appeared, slightly removed the pipe from his mouth and turned his head to the side, let out a wild cry, which seemed to combine the headache that had been consuming him since the morning, the desire to escape to the ends of the world and this strange feeling of regret for the wasted years of his life. "Pardon me, what did you say?" Mrs. Yonce asked with some surprise. Coming to his senses, Joe realized that he had just made a mistake by giving vent to his feelings. He said, "All right, Mrs. Yvette," I said. "All right." "Well, okay, otherwise it feels like you dropped the iron on your leg." She laughed at her own joke, and Mr. Thurlow decided not to be left out and joined his neighbor. "Okay, laughter, of course, is the best medicine, but you still shouldn't abuse it," a woman's voice reached Joe. "Now I'll boxing my daughter lunch so that if she suddenly gets hungry, she can have a snack at your house, and will come to you soon." "So," Mr. Thurlow said thoughtfully, "how many minutes should I expect you in?" How shall I say this? "We are going to leave the house in half an hour," the neighbor answered immediately. "But if you're not in the mood to see us today, then—" No, I just wanted to say that I don't really have any clean clothes," Joe interrupted her. "I wouldn't want to." "Don't worry about your appearance, Mr. Thurlow," his interlocutor began to calm down. "Just behave with dignity, that's all that's required of you." "Oh yeah, regarding clothes," after a pause she repeated. I was just getting ready to do the laundry after lunch, and since we don't have a lot of dirty laundry at home, then I can, as a neighbor, do you a favor, for the fact that you sit with Delia, I will wash your things. This is okay? Mr. Thurlow was digesting this long tirade from his new neighbor. Why on earth would she is so eager to gain his trust? Is this all really on the initiative of their daughter? Unable to find answers to the pile of questions that had piled up on his poor head, Joe said only yes into the phone. He received a chuckle and a cheerful 8 logo in response. I'm sorry, what did you just say? He asked. See you, Mrs. Yonce explained and hung up. Mr. Thurlow continued to hold the phone to his ear, but only beeps could be heard from it, indicating that the conversation between him and his neighbor had come to an end. He was still in shock from the content of the talking that had just happened between them. Slowly, as if half asleep, he put the phone down and plopped down in a chair, clutching his head with both hands. Darkness filled his gaze. Joe didn't know how long it had been since he hung up, but when from the yard the piercing bark of his faithful buffalo reached his ears, he, looking for yesterday's shorts and t-shirt, cursed in every possible way the Cronus, god of the harvest, who did not take pity on his pitiful slave and did not make any efforts to delay this inevitable meeting for as many hours as possible. Joe walked out onto the porch of his house. The rain, which he had the pleasure of seeing this morning, has finally stopped. He glanced at the wicket. Buffalo, as befits a good watchdog, ran near it and burst into barking. So, Mr. Thurlow thought, how great it would be now, but common sense reminded its nervous owner in time that this was complete idiocy. Let the dog loose on guests, especially if they are his neighbors and, most importantly, representatives of the better half of humanity. Sighing, Joe took the collar with the leash pre-attached to it hanging on a nail near the door and walked up to the wicket. The dog looked at the owner and continued to rush at the fence. The man had to almost forcefully put a collar on the powerful neck of his buffalo and, tying it to a pole that stood some distance from the entrance to the house, let the guests in. Greetings, Joe said to Mrs. Yonce. Hi there, he nodded to her daughter. Both women bowed to him and, stepping over the threshold, looked at the dog, which, at the sight of strangers, began to rear up, trying to get ahead. So, welcome to me, Mr. Thurlow smiled. As you can see, my dog is vicious. I think he'll get used to it, Mrs. Yonce said mysteriously, winking at little girl. Hey, where are you going? Exclaimed Joe as Delia began to approach Buffalo. What are you afraid of, Mr. Thurlow? He won't touch her, the neighbor said without a trace of concern. And how do you, he started. But Joe didn't have time to ask his question and died out in mid-sentence. Delia was already standing next to the dog, who had stopped trying to break free from the leash. Now he sat still and looked at the girl with puppy dog eyes. She bent down and, patting the Belgian Malinois behind the ear, started whispering something cheerfully to him. And her mother turned her head to Joe and smiled. How is that possible? Muttered Mr. Thurlow. Joe, feeling ashamed of his dog, tried to fight back the tears that were welling up in his throat. He could not even think that his buffalo, behind whom he always felt unquestioning loyalty to his master, would bend like a lamb to someone else's girl. How about you let us in, Mrs. Yonce said in a businesslike tone. Yes, Mrs. Yvette, right away, Joe answered briefly. Closing the wicket, he headed towards the porch. The woman stood in the yard for a while and, calling her daughter, slowly followed him. In the hallway, Joe, smiling embarrassedly, said that he could not offer the guests slippers or any other house shoes. Adult guest nodded understandingly. Well, yes, you couldn't imagine that a mom with kid would come to you, she said ironically. If it is no secret, when was the last time a woman set foot on your doorstep? 5 years ago, then my mother left this world, Joe said quietly. My sincere condolences to you, she answered in a cloudless mood. While the adults were having this dialogue, the little girl, without thinking twice, took off her shoes and, appearing before her mother and Joe in white stockings, jumped up and twirled in some kind of carefree dance. Be careful, Delia, don't get your stockings dirty, Mrs. Yonce said sternly. "Fear not, Mommy," the child said loudly. Delia stopped dancing and looked up at her mother. Then she turned her gaze to the owner of the house. "You have a very cute doggy, a Jussie Joe," she said ingratiatingly. "Well, yes," Mr. Thurlow began slowly. "I understand that I could not resist your charms." "Nothing can resist me," she answered with some pride. "No messing now, dearie," the mother again began to reason with her daughter. "I'm hungry," the girl ignored her words. "When are we going to eat?" When the child said these words, Mr. Thurlow only now noticed the picnic basket covered with a red towel, which Mrs. Yonce was holding in her hands. The latter nodded to Delia and asked the owner of the house to take them to the kitchen. Joe slowly trudged ahead of them. There was an emptiness in his soul at the moment. One might think that Delia's ringing voice extinguished all his thoughts. Entering the kitchen, Mr. Thurlow offered the guests chairs. Adult guest, thanking her, put the basket on the table and, taking off the towel from it, began to lay out the food from it. The baby girl did not sit down at the table. She went to the window and tried to open the tightly drawn curtains. Joe rushed after her and helped her in this matter. The kitchen was illuminated by the rays of the sun, which was already shining with all its might in the sky, which had already cleared of clouds. "Where are your dishes, Mr. Thurlow?" Joe moved away from the window and, opening the kitchen cabinet doors, asked a counter question. "What exactly should you submit, Mrs. Yvette?" The woman, after thinking a little, asked the owner of the house to get 2 large plates, 2 saucers and 2 cups, and the same number of forks and spoons. Noticing the bewilderment on his face, Mrs. Yonce said that she herself had already had a good breakfast, so she was giving all the food to him and her daughter. Shrugging his shoulders, Joe complied with her demands, taking out the necessary dishes and cutlery, placing them near the sink. "Let me myself," the woman said immediately. Mrs. Yonce took the initiative and began rinsing the dust-covered plates under running water. Joe stood next to her, not knowing what to do with himself. The little girl, who had previously been standing and looking out the window, came up to him and pulled him by the sleeve. "What do you want, Delia?" Mr. Thurlow asked her. "A Jussie Joe, do you have anything interesting?" "Toys or something?" Joe inquired. At the same time he tried to pull his hand away, but the child held tightly to his sleeve. "Books," she shouted. "I've already played enough in my 8 years," the girl suddenly said seriously. "Well, books," he thought. "I have a small library," Mr. Thurlow began. On these words Delia jumped in place. "But it's mostly just scientific gobbledygook," continued the owner of the house. "I love science books," the young guest interrupted him. "You talk about encyclopedias, but in my bookshelf I mostly have materials on higher mathematics," he said dryly. The little girl was a little depressed. Joe thought that he shouldn't have answered the child so categorically and, stopping trying to pull his hand out of her grip, said in a soothing tone that he could have been mistaken, because he practically doesn't read and already doesn't remember well what's there. "Okay, so let's look at your books," Delia asked him. "Why wouldn't he?" Joe answered cheerfully. The young guest let go of the man's hand and followed the owner of the house, who was already entering his office. There he opened the bookshelf and, squatting down, began to take out books from the lowest shelf, where, as he remembered, literature for children was kept, which his grandmother had willingly supplied him with at one time. Delia went to the nightstand, which stood next to the desk, and asked Joe what could be there. If memory serve, there are vinyl records. Without taking his eyes off the books, he threw over his shoulder. Delia, without asking permission, sharply pulled the handle towards herself. Joe, holding back from yelling at her, ran up to the nightstand, from which envelopes with records had already fallen out onto the floor, which seemed to be waiting in the wings to be released. Yes, he had already forgotten that the entire bedside table was filled to capacity with mummified music. Most of the vinyls belonged to his late mother. Others were gifts from Joe's own friends and classmates. But, unfortunately, the record turntable has not been in this house for a long time. Mr. Thurlow sold it when he needed money for a funeral. Although it was not a big problem, that record player could only play audio, recorded in monaural format, therefore, if he wanted, Joe could buy himself a normal stereo system, or even switch to compact discs, which were then gaining popularity. But somehow it turned out that with the death of his mother his attraction to music died too. That's why he lived with a nightstand full of vinyl records, which he needed like a dead duck. Now all this splendor lay on the floor at the knees of a little girl who, without knowing it, opened Joe's attic of reminiscences. She began to sort through the envelopes with interest. "Huzzah, I found it," she shouted joyfully. Mr. Thurlow sat down next to Delia and looked at the record cover. It was a photograph of wheat field with clouds hanging over it. A woman with a red scarf on her head, standing with her back to the viewer, swung a sickle at the ears of corn. "I'm so happy now," Delia repeated. Looking at the genuine joy of his guest, the owner of the house remembered how he got this record. This was 6 years ago. Then his mother was trying to resist the cancer that had almost completely overcome her. Hamish McIntosh, his classmate whose parents had just returned from vacation in Lisbon, for his 18th birthday, he gave him an album purchased there from a musical band that was then just gaining popularity. There were fresh memories of how Joe, while his mother was in the hospital, turned up the volume to maximum and turned on the record player. But perhaps the monophonic system could not cope with the stereophonic record. Maybe he just wasn't a fan of synthesizer sounds, but other than disappointment from these electronic squeakers, Joe received nothing then. This record has been collecting dust until today, when it didn't fall into hands moved to this village young fan of the genre, which for Mr. Thurlow was a mystery behind 7 seals. "A Jussie Joe, I can take this for myself, right?" the little girl asked, unable to contain her joy. "Of course you can take it," Joe yawned and, rising from his knees, added, "I see you really want this." "I just thought what would be best for Jerry," she said as if making excuses. "Who is Jerry?" Mr. Thurlow asked without much interest. "That's, Delia's cheeks turned red. "That's boy, with whom I study in the same class. Most likely, this is her school sweetheart." "Common thing," Joe thought. "He loves electronic music," continued the girl. "I made him a promise that I would give him one of these records for his 8th birthday. "What date is his birthday, may I ask?" Joe already felt interested in talking with this child. "And if it's my secret, then what?" Delia made a serious face. "Then I won't pester you with questions about your classmates," Mr. Thurlow conceded to his young interlocutor. "All right, I'll tell you what," the baby girl said as if she was doing her a favor. "And she told he this?" Joe thought, "Delia's boyfriend's birthday falls on that day, when I found out that my mother would never be with me again." Mr. Thurlow, of course, did not tell his young guest anything about this, but he couldn't help but notice to myself that it can be funny, that chance is a strange thing, because nothing prevents the process of death and birth from happening one after another. "But you would probably be interested in listening to this record yourself, wouldn't you?" he said out loud. The girl's eyes darted around. She jokingly swung a blue and yellow envelope at him. "What gives you that idea?" she said with cheerful malice. "It's in those eyes of yours, though," he answered calmly. In order not to disturb the atmosphere of fun that hovered in the room, Mr. Thurlow took the blow with a record packed in an envelope. How fun it was, sitting like that and communicating with the child. Until this moment Joe could afford this, except perhaps during those times when he himself was in his childhood years. Looking back, he could say with confidence that it was on that day that he began to treat Delia as something more than just a neighbor. While Joe and Delia sat on the floor in his office, the girl's mother finished setting the table in the kitchen. Having washed her hands and leaning half a step into the office. "And on that lovely note, y'all, welcome to the table," she shouted. 2 voices mixed in response to her invitation. "Thank you, Mrs. Yvette," Joe replied. "Thank you, Mommy." Delia did not remain in debt. Of all 3 who were now within the walls of this house, it was its owner who wanted to eat the most. Therefore, he did not hesitate and, getting to his feet, went to the kitchen, where the table was already set, the richness of which struck the imagination of Mr. Thurlow, who, due to some stinginess, usually ate scrambled eggs and store-bought sandwiches. But what is good for a grown man, for a child? No, not better, rather just the opposite. Perhaps such a definition should not be applied to all children, but as for the young heiress of the Yonce family. While Joe happily devoured what was on the table, the little girl fidgeted in her chair and looked bored, picking at her plate with a fork. Only when it was time to drink tea did she perk up a little and, not depriving herself of sweets, took a couple of eclairs. "Dearie, you can't eat nothing and indulge in sweets," Mrs. Yonce took on an educational tone. "Mom, come on, I'm just embarrassed, child." He decided not to interfere in this exchange of words. It seemed to Joe that neighbor would begin to reproach him for the fact that her daughter did not really eat anything. Like, considering how quickly you eat everything, she thought it was better not to snatch the last piece from you and leave everything as it is. "Mr. Thurlow," a woman turned to him, "will you walk us to the gate? Otherwise—" "What, that is all," her daughter interrupted with a hint of obvious irritation. "Delia." "Don't offend the mother," Mrs. Yonce said with about the same intonation. Joe decided that if the fire of discontent begins to flare up between women, then it is better not to loom under their noses and retreat. He wiped the crumbs stuck to the corners of his mouth and stood up from his chair. Oh, finally, the woman was happy. "Let's go, Mr. Thurlow, Delia are already complete." The owner of the house nodded to his adult guest and was about to go out onto the porch, when she suddenly let out a loud ah, and asked where Joe's dirty clothes were. He remembered the telephone conversation that took place this morning between him and his neighbor, after which, slamming the front door, he went to help her pack that very flower-covered suit. The little girl, delighted at the fact that she could stay in this new place for at least a couple of extra minutes, ran to his office. When the adults finally finish their deeds, just fold the clothes and put them in the previously emptied picnic basket. Delia hasn't left the room yet. Her mother's telling her that it was time for them to leave had no effect on her daughter. Joe, signaling to Mrs. Yonce to wait a little, quietly, as if a hunter, afraid of spooking his prey, entered his own office. There he witnessed Delia, standing at the window, vigorously gesticulating to someone. Mr. Thurlow coughed ingratiatingly. Baby girl turned her head towards him. There was no feeling of surprise on her face, rather some kind of businesslike. Joe became curious about what interested her and also stood at the window, which overlooked the back side of his property. Of course there was no one there. Mr. Thurlow touched the shoulder of Delia standing in front of him with his index finger. She reluctantly turned away from the window and, lowering her head, went to her mother, who was nervously moving from foot to foot, holding a basket in her hands. "Can I carry?" Joe decided to show gallantry. "We'll only get to the wicket, to our house, on our own," Mrs. Yonce interrupted him. He took the basket from woman's hands and the three of them went out into the yard. Clouds began to creep in on the sun again. Mr. Thurlow looked at his dog. He sat quietly at the post, not making a sound. The girl intimidated him, Joe thought. As they approached the fence, a loud and dissatisfied sniffling reached Joe's ears from the street. Opening the wicket, he almost came face to face with Mr. Yonce, who, with his hands on his hips, looked at his neighbor with some hatred. However, the sight of his wife and daughter leaving the yard slightly reduced the degree of his displeasure and he, taking the basket from his spouse, walked ahead of his family, giving Mr. Thurlow a parting look full of suspicion. Joe, having shouted after the Yonce family the duty till we meet again, closed the gate and headed to the post to untie Buffalo. Oddly enough, as soon as the women left the territory, the dog immediately began barking and rushing in all directions. His owner had to make a lot of effort to hold the dog and remove the collar from his neck. As soon as Buffalo felt free, he ran up to the fence and began jumping on it again. Joe, still perplexed by such a dramatic change in his pet's mood, stifled a yawn and, hanging the leash on a nail, walked into the house. He walked into the kitchen and glanced at the table, on which only dirty plates remained from its former splendor. In any case, he was no longer hungry, so he collected all the dishes and started to wash them in the sink, began to wonder what he should do now. Having finished washing the dishes, he carefully put them in their places and looked at his wristwatch. Yes, the shops will be closing soon, Joe thought. In order not to meet tomorrow like this, i.e. without food, he went to the store. When Mr. Thurlow was already returning back with the packages, the sun was already setting. Passing near the neighbor's gate, he again noticed Mr. Yonce's car near them, which he had last seen yesterday morning. Without trying to make any sense of it, Mr. Thurlow went into his home and unpacked his groceries. Looking around at the full shelves of the refrigerator, Joe slammed the door and remembered that he had forgotten to put the books and records that had fallen out back. He entered the office. When his gaze fell on the books and envelopes scattered on the floor, he suddenly felt sad. Joe felt something like loss for the first time in years. In no hurry to start cleaning, he went over the events of the past day in his head. Here he and his young guest come into his office, so he begins to pull books out of the closet, and she opens the nightstand without asking. Here he is in a hurry to the sound of records falling to the floor. And then he allows the little girl to take away a music album that is of no interest to him. Joe ran out of the office. No, I can't remove the consequences of this, I can't, he thought in despair. He ran into the bedroom and buried his face in the pillows. 24-year-old Jordan Thurlow cried like a child whose strict parents forbade him to communicate with the friend he was interested in. When Joe went to the bathroom, wiping away his tears, he muttered under his breath something like, "Delia was right, you, Joe, is big crybaby and you're worthless." Already standing at the mirror and looking at his reddened eyes, it seemed to him for a second that the outlines of his own face had something in common with the face of his little neighbor. But when he, having washed himself properly, looked at his reflection again, this strange feeling disappeared, as if it had never been there. Feeling the need for fresh air, Mr. Thurlow went out into the yard. It was already getting dark. His faithful buffalo lay quietly in his place, getting ready for the sleep. Joe looked at the home of Yonce's family. Despite the late hour, only one window on the first floor was light. Mr. Thurlow couldn't know how the neighbors arranged their rooms, but he remembered that when old man Harris Sherwind lived in this house, the chants of his drunken drinking companions were constantly heard from that window. So this was the living or dining room, Joe thought. Perhaps the new owners saved electricity and in the evenings turned on the lights only where three of them could gather, and in their personal rooms they made do with small lamps. Mr. Thurlow couldn't be sure. After all, this is never the ultimate truth, just his guesses. He suddenly remembered his very first meeting with Delia, when he stood on the other side of the fence and she looked at him from the second-floor window. No, Joe thought, his guess about saving light was complete nonsense, because at that moment, when according to the clock it was no later than now, the light was definitely on in the nursery. At the same time, he dismissed the idea that Delia was probably now outside the walls of her home. There is, of course, a possibility that she was taken to some relatives who lived in the center, but he had some doubts about this. The next morning, Joe opened his eyes and stared at the chandelier hanging from the bedroom ceiling. The glass saucer had a pattern painted in blue, the details of which seemed to depict some kind of birds. For some reason, contemplating this pattern made Mr. Thurlow fall into a state close to a trance. Looking steadily at this creation of an unknown decorator, he recalled that the sky was in similar colors on the cover of the record that Delia took yesterday. Shaking the disease, Joe started getting dressed. Remembering that the girl was going to give that record to her classmate for his birthday, he thought that, after all, the fate of things can sometimes be very funny. At first, the envelope with this album came from the factory to some music store in Lisbon. Then he moved to the living room of parents of Hamish McIntosh, his own classmate. And even in Portland the cycle hasn't ended, because first, after lying at that guy's house, the record fell into Joe's hands. Now it is in the power of a girl living in a neighboring house, and then the album will travel again, only now to the house of a certain Jerry, who, as Mr. Thurlow realized, lives somewhere in the center. When his brain has already digested this stream of thoughts, Joe was already standing in the kitchen, washed and dressed. Opening the refrigerator, He thanked himself for not forgetting to go grocery shopping in advance yesterday. Looking at how the eggs were placed in the cardboard, for some reason he could not help but notice how ingeniously but simply the packaging was designed. Having stopped turning them over in his hands, he suddenly remembered the cookies that Japhet had treated him to not so long ago. After placing the eggs on the table, Mr. Thurlow began to look for a mixer. Alas, he was in terrible condition, where the wire connected to the device itself, the insulation seemed to be charred. Joe decided not to plug it in, fearing that he might get an electric shock, and, putting the mixer back in the cabinet, began to think about how he could beat the eggs. After all, he cannot make shortbread dough without breaking eggs. And then Mr. Thurlow, inspired by yesterday's show of concern on the part of Mrs. Yonce, let out a joyful exclamation. What if he asked them for their mixer for an hour or two? If she agreed to wash his things, then what's wrong with not lending her neighbor a cooking appliance? Hastily, as if trying not to fly into heaven with happiness, Joe dialed their phone number and, pressing the receiver to his ear, waited patiently for the person on the other end to come to the machine. Fortunately, he didn't have to wait long for an answer. A minute later he heard the slightly sleepy voice of Mrs. Yonce. "Hi, I'm listening." "Hello, did I bother you, Mrs. Yvette?" Joe said a little too cheerfully. "It's okay, we're already up." "What do you want, Mr. Thurlow?" "I decided to start baking," he said. "Oh, this is just wonderful." Unexpectedly his interlocutor let out a joyful exclamation. "What are you going to cook for us?" "For us?" He was taken aback by her question. "Well, aren't you going to give Delia and me a treat?" "No, of course," Mr. Thurlow answered politely, who was already beginning to regret that he had decided to call them. "That is great. So what will you bake?" "Shortbread." "But the thing is..." "Wow, we love shortbread." "Mrs. Yvette, you didn't listen to me. I wanted to ask you one thing. Don't have a recipe? If you want, I can write now. I need a mixer." Joe is already tired of talking to her. "Okay, Mr. Thurlow, I'll send Delia to you. She was going to go for a walk anyway, so let her help you, give you." "Thank you, Miss Yvette," he interrupted her. "When should I go outside?" "In 10 minutes. "We'll wash and get dressed," said the woman, as if I was coddling a baby. "Well, goodbye." He heard that Portuguese interjection again and hung up. Sitting down in a chair to catch his breath, he imagined himself as some kind of 6-year-old blockhead, whose mother, without delving into the feelings of her son, is trying to force him to be a friend of a boy with good and exemplary behavior. Joe felt like fate was playing a cruel joke on him. Why didn't he suffer a little and go to town for a new mixer? Who dared him to call these obsessive Yonces? Mr. Thurlow wanted to punch that invisible and powerful being who was pulling his strings in the face, but common sense told him that this was in no way possible to realize, because the fate of a human is decided by the human himself. Joe went out into the yard in advance so that when the little girl came to the wicket, he would not make her wait several minutes, as happened yesterday. He called Buffalo and wanted to put the collar on him again, but, remembering that Delia would not come to him, he limited himself to patting the dog on the back. Then Mr. Thurlow sat down on the cold stone steps of the porch. Maybe it wasn't a very smart decision. He remembered how his mother told him as a child that he should not sit on a rock, but he wanted to quickly finish with this task imposed by himself. When he heard quick footsteps on the other side of the fence, Joe immediately rose from his seat and walked to the wicket. Buffalo did not move from his place, continuing to sit at the post. Mr. Thurlow opened the wicket and saw his young neighbor. In her right hand she was holding a package containing a cardboard box. Joe wanted to just take the mixer from her hands, but Delia, without saying a word, decisively stepped over the threshold. He looked after baby girl in bewilderment and followed her. They went into the kitchen, where the young lady put a bag on the table and asked the owner of the house if she could wash her hands. Joe said that since she came into his house as if it were her own, then let her do everything as she sees fit. She thanked him with a smile and went to the bathroom. Mr. Thurlow decided not to embarrass the child and went out into the yard, mentally trying to understand her behavior. He stood and looked at the dog. After a couple of minutes, he suddenly shuddered and turned around. It turns out that Delia had quietly crept up behind him and lightly shoved him in the back. He watched as she laughed at her prank and did not scold her. "Well, apparently they've been waiting for you at home," he said with a sigh. "They let me go for a walk. You heard what Mom said," the girl answered, blinking twice. "But my home is not a place for walking," Mr. Thurlow rightly noted. "So let's go outside, Jessie Joe," the baby said cheerfully. And she, bursting into laughter, ran to the wicket. Joe, not fully understanding her intentions, followed her. "Gotta go fast," Delia shouted as she walked.